Hello, everybody. Good evening. I'm Karen Benfield, President of the Board of Directors of New York City Audubon. I know we're still waiting for some people to enter the Zoom, but on behalf of the board and the Advisory Council, I thank you all for joining New York City Audubon this evening for this very special presentation. By supporting this event, you have made an investment in our science and conservation work and in avian biodiversity, and we appreciate this so much. I also note that we have viewers from all over, even outside the New York City area. We're delighted to have you all with us, and we hope that observing raptors in your area give you the same thrill that pale male has given to us here in New York City. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Kevin Burgio, Director of Conservation and Science at New York City Audubon, so that he can introduce our special guest this evening. Kevin, over to you.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you everybody again for coming tonight. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce Bruce Yolton this evening. For the last 15 years, Bruce has chronicled the life and adventures of pale male and New York City area hawks on his amazing blog, UrbanHawks.com. Bruce is a retired IT professional and an accomplished photographer whose photo and video credits appear in major publications, including the New York Times, New York Magazine, NPR, HBO, and National Geographic. Bruce's commitment to hawk watching and education dovetail with New York City Audubon's long history of raptor protection and advocacy. Tonight, you will learn so much about pale male, arguably the world's most famous raptor, and we hope that you will see urban raptors through new eyes. Before we get to the presentation, there will be a time for question and answers after the program. If you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. And with that, we are so grateful for Bruce's generosity in sharing his program this evening. Please welcome Bruce Yolton.
Good evening. Thank you, Karen and Kevin. It's really great to be here this evening, and I'm thrilled. Let me just start my presentation, and we'll go forward. So I just love pale male, and I love him just the way he is, and without any of the hoopla about him. I just love watching him, and I've spent hours and hours photographing him. And I really want to share that basic, just getting to see him and know him with you this evening. So I'm going to do a little bit of introduction about him, and then I'm going to go through some of the history of him and the basics of him. And then we're going to watch a whole series of video clips taking us through a full year of his life. Most of the footage I've chosen is from 2017. And then I'll go a little bit about how to watch him yourself if you want to. And that sort of how to watch a hawk is the same for any red tail, no matter where it is. So we'll give you some lessons on how to do that. And then I wanted to go through, pale male is no longer the only hawk in Manhattan. And there are a lot of hawks here, and just want to go through what sort of happened in the last 30 years and how they've expanded. And then I'm going to thank New York City Audubon, who I think is a wonderful organization, and I thank you all for giving money to it. And we'll do Q&A. Kevin will help coordinate that, and we'll go from there. So for me, pale male is just, it's not that he was the first hawk here. It's not that he lived among all these rich celebrities on Fifth Avenue. It's not even that he was famous from books and movies, or how long he's lived. But for me is that he is probably, arguably the most accessible raptor in North America. He is a bird that thousands and thousands and thousands of people have watched firsthand. And that joy of just seeing a raptor and getting to explore and understand that is just, I think, just a tremendous joy. And I just love seeing him in all seasons and all the time. I can pretty much see him anytime I want. And anytime I go to the park, I can usually find him. So pale male is a red-tailed hawk. We believe he's about 31. Pale male is a literal name. He's a pale colored hawk. But it turns out that in the northeast of America, of the United States, he's not abnormally light. There are a lot of hawks that look like pale male. So he's not extra special in being pale. And he's somebody who lives in the middle of the park, sort of between 68th and 86th Street, and from Park Avenue to the middle of Central Park. And depending on where it is, he's a little bit further west in the territory with Octavia, his mate. And their nest location is on Central Park, on 5th Avenue, on a building that's 927, and it's at 74th Street. So it's in a very nice neighborhood. He's chosen the best real estate. And one of the things that people commonly mix up is that he lives there, right? So he doesn't live there. He has a nest there. And the nest gets used primarily between March and June. And then he might make some visits to it, but he doesn't sleep there ever. And so it's, the nest isn't, people come in the middle of winter and say, where's the nest? I want to find pale male. And that's not how it works. He's had a lot of mates. And when I counted them up, the ones where he's nested with them, I counted 7. But there was one that came, and then she kind of really didn't gel with pale male one winter, and then another one replaced. So I count 7 or 8. The diet is mostly rodents and birds, so it's rats, mice, squirrels, and mostly pigeons, although he's known to eat a few songbirds every once in a while, and he will raid a nest of a robin and eat the babies out of the nest, and so that's something he does. And then he's not migratory, so he's here all the time. So he's here year-round with his mate, and so they're here all the time. And one of the things that's been a debate in the last maybe 5 or 6 years is whether pale male really is pale male. Some people are feeling that he is too old and can't possibly be the same one, that he got replaced. So I always like to say that you can make two arguments, and you can make a really good case for both. So you can say that he's hit all the photographs. If you look at all the photographs that have been taken, which is thousands and thousands and thousands, it's pretty consistent that it's pale male. The other thing is his behavior, including his perches, are always the same. So when we've had pale male's mates change, those behaviors and perches have changed. So right when Octavia came, she chose very different places to perch, and she in very, very different places than what had been in the hawks before her. And she chose where she wanted the kids to go, her young fledglings to go, was different from what the previous hawks had done. So very, very consistent. And so you can make a really good case for it being the original pale male. The other side, though, will say, maybe that pale male isn't that unique. We've got other hawks that look like him. We do know that red tails switch mates within a day or two. So we've had experience in Washington Square Park where a hawk got replaced, and the female was replaced within 24 hours, and it was like nothing had happened. So very quickly switching. So maybe, people say maybe a similarly looking hawk got replaced in the winter when people really weren't looking hard. And then 31 is really pushing the envelope for age for a hawk. So I think if you talk to the folks who, and I've only watched pale male for 15 years, for those people who actually watched for that sort of almost, 29, 30-year-old, 30 period, and there are probably 10 of them that I know that have that longevity with him, they're all clearly believing that it's still the original. But I think you can make a case for either side. I think it's important, though, to not argue with the other side, but just sort of to talk about it and be polite. One thing I do know is that it's not pale male's son and not his grandson. So because in hawks, the nest has, if a mate gets lost, you still got the other. So if pale male died, there'd still be Octavia, and Octavia wouldn't, she wouldn't be sleeping with her son. So it doesn't make sense. So a lot of people will say, oh, it's not pale male, it must be pale male junior, has got sort of the science wrong. But if you ask me over drinks, I'd say it's definitely the same one. But I respect the people who have the other opinion. So what's his timeline? So he was born in 1990, and he arrived as an immature hawk the next year. And then, like many hawks, it took a while to get everything together and to have the first successful nest. And then in 2004, the nest got taken down, and then it got restored thanks to the work of New York City Audubon. They arranged for a cradle to be built and for the nest to be able to be built back by the hawks, and they did a great job, and they nested that spring. But there was from that time on until Lola, who was the current mate, died, the eggs didn't hatch. And I think it was a tough period because they had built this aluminum cradle to hold the nest. There was a lot of sort of ambivalence about whether, was it the cradle that made it not, things weren't working. And it does turn out that it most likely was that Lola had become infertile, because as soon as she disappeared in 2010, we started to have a very successful set of nests through 3 different mates. And that continued through 2018. And then the last 2 years, although Octavia laid eggs, they didn't hatch. So, but this is an incredible period to nest from, really for a 25-year period in the exact same place for a hawk is just a tremendous thing. And the fact that nest has existed and so many people have watched, it's just a fantastic thing that pale male has been so accessible to everyone. He's obviously had lots of publicity. A fantastic book by Marie Wynn, Red Tails in Love. Not 1, but 3 children's books about it. And then Frederic Lillian has 2 movies. And for those who are interested, The Legend of Pale Male, during COVID, Frederic made it available for free on his website for the movie. So anyone who's interested in that movie, one can just watch them. So that's nice of him. And then tons of articles, obviously, when the nest got taken down, lots of publicity. And so I think everyone in New York knows who pale male is. And then I think it's important just to say that in general, birds and especially hawks have a tremendous ability to get into trouble and die frequently, and we have lots of problems. And so in New York, the major ones are deaths from rodenticides. They also cause fertility problems in hawks. A disease called France. We still have West Nile virus in New York. And lead poisoning has been a problem recently at 2 different nests. And especially when there's a lot of construction in a park, it has a tendency to bring up the lead gets into the plant life, it ends up getting into it gets into pigeons, and then into pigeons it gets into the hawks. So, and then of course we have problems with traffic and building collisions in New York. So with all that background, I'll get to just a year of pale male. And for us, I think for most hawk watchers, Valentine's Day is the day that we look forward to, because it's when all our hawks in the city start to copulate. And the copulation doesn't take long. It's only a few seconds. But we really see this as kind of the beginning of the season. It's still cold in New York. It might be snow on the ground, but we know spring is coming because we see this copulation. And in addition to copulating, we'll see a lot of activity at the nest. So there's a lot of spring cleaning. And also pale male and Octavia, who in the wintertime actually don't spend a lot of time together. They might be blocks apart, and they might end up roosting together at night, but they kind of are little independent, start to spend a lot of time with each other. So you see them on the Carlisle Hotel, and you see them on some of the nearby buildings together. And so we kind of know the season's going to begin. And the other thing is that pale male starts to be sort of aggressive against hawks that come near the nest, especially younger ones who might have had sort of a free ride during the winter, but they get pushed out and, basically said, hey, time to move on, guys. And then eggs get laid in late March. So depending on the hawks in the city, we sometimes maybe the first week of March, but usually late March for most hawks in the city here at our latitude. And before they actually get laid, Octavia will start spending the night for a few days. It's kind of, I sort of feel like Cinderella, that she's making sure the nest is just right to be there and lay eggs, and so that happens. And they lay 2 to 3 eggs, and they get laid a few days apart, and they'll actually hatch a few days apart as well. And then once the eggs are there, they have to roll the eggs, and so that happens every hour and a half or so. And then you can see here that pale male's brought a treat to Octavia, and she's going to go fly off and eat her meal, and he'll then take over for maybe half an hour, the incubation duties. I always like to say this is kind of the most absolutely boring period of watching hawks, because for the most part, all you see is a little bit of a head, and then you have to wait maybe 5 hours to find them to switch and hop up, or to see that glimpse for 5 minutes and the eggs get rolled. So we're very grateful when we're hawk watchers that when they finally do hatch, because then there's lots to watch. In late April or early May, depending on the hawk in the nest, typically for pale male, I think it's usually early May, the eggs hatch, and they hatch a few days apart. And we'll see, first we don't see the actual hatchlings at all, the young ices. We just see what looks like feeding. And then maybe after like 5 or 6 or 7 days, then we actually can see little white heads come up. And I'm just always amazed, because for this last long period, we've seen, aggressive hunting and fierce hawks. And then all of a sudden, this mother is just gently feeding food. And here's pale male. That was a kestrel that was attacking him. So his job during this period is sort of guard duty and to hunt. And then Octavia is doing all of this really wonderful pulling of the food, making sure it's a little small, it's the right bite-sized little morsel. And she turns her head gently to a 45-degree angle so she can gently feed it to the young eyes. So it's fascinating, and gets lots of oohs and ahs when people see through a telescope this activity. So when they're on the nest, I think I think of it as sort of a 3-period piece. So the first period is little fluffy white irises. And then there's a transition period where they're growing up and getting bigger, and their feathers are coming in, where they're sort of ugly ducklings. And then we get to a point where they're close to leaving the nest and fledgling, and they're just beautiful, fully feathered, perfect little birds, and they're practicing by flapping to get ready to fly. So we have these 3 periods. What I'm going to do is go through, I edited some videos so we can watch sort of how things progress. So this is what happened in 2017. So we had, what I said before is that we can't see the babies, but we see all this pulling and feeding. So I'm actually 4 blocks away at the frick, so I can get this angle, hoping that I could have gotten a little shot of a white head, but I just only got the movement of that. And here we have, finally I can see some little white heads, and that poop that went across there lands on the awning of 927. And so sometimes the first people who know that the eggs have hatched are the doormen, because they hear the patter of those poops on the awning of 927. So just, this period when you're just seeing the heads, we also don't know how many kids have hatched because we don't know how many eggs there were. We can't see into the nest. So a lot of work goes in on this first few weeks of just detective work, because the babies, they sleep so much. The Isis sleep so much. You might see only 2 heads for a week, and then all of a sudden, out of the blue, at maybe 14 days, you see 3 heads, and you go, oh, they had 3. So you get excited that you finally got the count, that they all 3 were awake, and you got to see that. So we have lots of activity during this early period. So I think she has a pigeon there, and you can see a lot of tiny little feathers blowing off in the wind. And obviously it can get pretty windy up there, so she got blown around them. So here we are in May, and so you can see the kids are a lot bigger. They're moving around a lot more. They're starting to get their primary and secondary feathers in. You can see a little dot in the face next to the eye there. That's the ear canal, which you don't see once the feathers have grown over it. And the kids can walk all around the nest at this point. And also in the early stages when they're very small, Octavia stays to make sure that they stay warm if it's a cold day. Where once we get to this stage, it's less important for her to be there to keep them warm. And so she does things like bring in twigs and leaves. And you can see here we're starting to see coloring on the chest. And it's just a lot of fun. And they're able to sort of climb around. They're clumsy at this point, but they're no longer these sort of white, innocent, fluffy things anymore. So we've another week in, so you can see the feathers are coming in, and especially on the wings, and there's a lot more brown here on the primary and secondary feathers, so that's all coming in. And they're really alert at this age, so they're very much looking at everything. So anytime a pigeon flies by or any other bird, they're scanning it and seeing what happens. They see that pale male is coming with food, and they are very alert, and they sort of run to the edge and do stuff. And so pale male during this period is basically gathering food for the family, and when it's a bird like a pigeon, he cleans it before he brings it up, and does that for. So here again, we have the kids growing a little older, and they're getting a nice sort of orangey color to their chests, and starting to run around the nest a lot more than they were. So it's nice. And then close to them leaving the nest, we get all of this flapping, and people call it jump flapping. So they sort of jump and flap. And they seem to they sort of accidentally sort of then always are hitting their siblings. So it's kind of funny to watch. Like that right now, that one was like, why are you hitting me? So I find this adorable behavior. So we're waiting for them. The sort of last things that we're looking to see grow in are good long tails. And if you see the feathering on the head all filled in, that means they're probably ready. So these are just a little bit too soon. And pale male's kids have these, I call them sort of spotted pantaloons along their thigh there. They get these little white dots, these little brown dots. And that's not always the case depending on which hawk you're with. So So this guy, look, you can see, so the head looks pretty good, but the tail is probably a few days too short for leaving the nest. But this guy's going to be going pretty soon. And again, pale male is always keeping watch here. So he's usually maybe a block or two away and keeping all the guard duty that he can do and making sure that they're safe. And then he goes hunting for them. So here they are, looking pretty spiffy, 3 of them. And we're close to them leaving. And also at this time, the mother, Octavia, who had in the beginning spends all the time with them, leaves them alone for hours. So I said before we had this jump flapping, and this is kind of in general, things work out, but every once in a while they get into traffic or land on a car when they leave. So when we're watching all of this activity, hoping to watch the fledge, we're really worried a little bit. So mostly they land in some tree, sometimes on the Fifth Avenue side or sometimes on the park side of Fifth Avenue. So sometimes on the east side or sometimes on the building side, or sometimes they'll be in trees just close to the edge of the park, over the sidewalk, or they'll actually land in the park. So I think all of us who watch hawks and watch these kids leave are thrilled to do it, but we actually have a little bit of we're always a little worried. So it's a fun time. And then, so we have June, and again, these kids, at this point, the roles change. So pale male, who had been sort of in a passive role, and Octavia had been doing all the work. Now the child care responsibilities end up being pale males, and he ends up taking that very seriously and is very protective of them. So if they get mobbed by blue jays, he'll distract the blue jays and get them away from them. And he's always keeping an eye out for things, and of course still feeding them. And in this first period in June, I think because nature wants these hawks to get out of trouble, their instinct for the first week or two is to go as high as possible. And in a world where there are trees, that means the top of trees. But on Fifth Avenue, his offspring try to go to the tops of the buildings. And so they're always all over the balconies and on windowsills. And one of the things that happens is these fledglings know how to fly, but they don't really know how to land. They have to learn how to land and coordinate. So just lots of excitement and missed landings and worrying that they're going to get into traffic, which rarely happens, but it's something that is a worry. So people keep a good eye on them and see how things are going. But this is Octavia keeping an eye out for these little guys. They're begging for food a lot of times, so they call a lot. And so when you're trying to find them, you just listen, and then you try to find the sound, and then you'll be able to get them. So, but the sort of amount of curiosity and trying to learn and figure out, you can see them try to sort of figure out, how do I get to the next perch? How do I get to the next ledge? How do I get, and it's just fascinating to see them learning and exploring in this period. And again, pale male is doing his job of keeping a good eye on them. So once they've mastered flying and landing, next is a lot of sort of figuring out how to pounce on prey. And so that means a lot of play and a lot of play on the ground. And this is really normal for young red tails. And there's always someone who comes who wants to call the police that the red tails, that there's a red tail on the ground. And the people who are the regular hawk watchers go, no, 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 it's okay, it's okay, it's okay, it's learning. So lots of pouncing on sticks, lots of, sometimes they'll play in fountains as well. So just lots of, learning how to basically get ready for being able to get food on their own. So July is sort of see them a lot on the ground, see them try to hunt. They're still really dependent on pale male to feed them, but occasionally you have a very precocious one who learns how to catch mice right away. And some take a lot longer. So there's also individual personality in all of these youngsters. And again, they're always very noisy and just fascinating. Here's one with a butterfly. So that kind of cuteness and that kind of exploration and play is really how I feel about this season in pale male's children's lives, and just love watching the sort of learning that happens. But I think this is later on in the month. You can see sort of much more experience, much less bewilderment, and much more confidence. And that is what I think July is about. But by the end of July, these young hawks are pretty much getting along on how to hunt and whatnot. And pale male during this period too will hunt in front of them, intentionally sort of showing them the ropes. So that's also a really nice time to watch pale male do that kind of, they'll do it in front of them. And also pale male and Octavia, but especially pale male, will use food. He'll catch something and then he'll circle with it to try to move them to a certain place that he thinks is a good place for them to either be playing or be fed or to learn to feed. And so he uses that food to sort of move them around. So August is, when we get to August, the fledglings have learned how to hunt on their own. And for those people who are watching those kids, it becomes much, much harder to find them because they're no longer begging for food, and they're also exploring more of the park. So they had maybe they were within a few blocks, like a block or two section of the park, and then all three were together because they were being fed. Once they can feed on their own, they kind of, one goes one direction by 5 blocks, and one goes another direction by 5 blocks, and one goes another direction by 5 blocks. And so it's easy to lose track of them. And, what was a very consistent, easy thing becomes much more difficult. But it's good to see them grow up, and it's good to know that they're going to become self-sufficient during this period. So this one has caught something on its own yet. It's got a pigeon. And so I think when we see all of this behavior in August, we just kind of know that things are going to look at. Although in reality, I think, a young hawk has maybe a 60% chance of dying its first year. So it's a tough life. So another pigeon here. And then when we get to late August or September, the kids just leave. And I think for a lot of us who spend time watching, it's kind of disappointing because there's no going away party. We don't know that they're going to leave, and all of a sudden they disappear. And the hawks, these young hawks, tendency to fly and sort of disperse a long ways away from Central Park. And so we have a tendency to just sort of like, it's over. And then we're back to watching Pale Male and Octavia. And so that's what happens for us in the fall. And for the fall, what we see is we pretty much find in the afternoons Pale Male eating a rat. And so he has a few places he likes. One is near Turtle Pond, sort of north of the Polish statue. And he has a branch that he uses that I call the picnic table because it's a nice level branch. And so he catches things in the area and he brings it to this branch. And he has an easy place that's very safe to eat his meal. And you know, for maybe 6 to 8 weeks, it's very consistent that he'll be eating here every afternoon. And I think people know to come find it. But it does become harder to find it. And later in the fall, it's tough. The pattern isn't there. And he has a tendency to move around. So maybe he's eating further north for 2 weeks, and then maybe closer to the reservoir for 2 weeks. And so it takes a little practice to sort of figure out where he's going in this period. But, you know, really, really great to watch him. But seeing him eat is basically the behavior we see in the fall. So otherwise he's high up on buildings and whatnot during the morning. And the winter, I think the winter is, you usually see him calmly somewhere, just hanging out. Here he's hanging out in the snow. And what I enjoy about this period is you can sit with him for an hour or two. So hawks have, in the winter, I think he's taking maybe 45 minutes to eat every day, and the rest of the time is free time. So he's just exploring, hanging out on buildings or hanging out in the ramble. And when you have him in the ramble or something, you can just sit there and just spend time with him watching. So it's enjoyable. This period of time, they're not, Octavia and Pale Male aren't spending much time with each other during the day. They're usually, you know, blocks apart, but they do have a tendency to roost together. So they're still a couple, but it's not, you know, they're not spending the whole time with each other. So with that, I think I've gone through, you know, this cycle will repeat, and we'll have Valentine's Day again, and we'll have copulation again, and we'll have this cycle happen again. So this is sort of a year with Pale Male. So I hope you've enjoyed that year. I love having a year with you. So I wanted to go through a little bit about how to find him. And so the first thing is you can locate him and any redtail by listening. So blue jays and robins and squirrels are scared of Pale Male, and they all have their own alarm calls. And so they will be very vocal to tell you that there's a hawk nearby. And if you, after a month or two of being with people who watch hawks, you'll instantly learn the alarm calls, and those calls are your friend. And then when there are fledglings, they love to beg for food. So whenever they see Pale Male, they will start yelling because they think there's food coming. So listening is a really important skill in hawk watching. And then, you know, just watch. Pale Male if he swoops through a set of pigeons that, 72nd Street has some lampposts that maybe have 20 pigeons. Whenever he flips through there, the pigeons all fly up. And so you kind of know that he might be behind them all. So it gives you a clue to kind of watch. Pale males, any hawk has a tendency to defecate before it takes off. And so most of us who watch hawks, when we see that, we go, oh, he's going to leave. And so it helps us get ready with our binoculars to figure out where he's going next. And the other thing about pale male is I think he has a tendency to be a creature of habit. So if you find where he's been eating for that day, then you go back there the next day, because that's probably where he's going to be. He can mix it up, but it's a good way of sort of go back to where you last saw him, and that's a good rule. And then location, I think, is important because people get confused about some of the things that happen in the hawk's life. So there's a nest, and the nest is a place to raise children. It's a nursery. They're perches for pale male. So those are places that he likes to sit. He has favorite hunting spots, and he has favorite eating spots, and he has favorite places to sleep. So there are different kinds of places based on the time of day of where you would look. So you learn a little bit about that difference between those. And so you think, oh, is it roosting time? Well, there's a few that people know about, and people will go to those trees and say, oh, he's coming to bed. But you wouldn't go there if you knew it was mealtime. So you figure out those kinds of things based on what time of day it is and what you think's happening. And of course, what time of year it is matters too, because if it's spring, he'll be near the nest. Even if he's not on the nest, he's watching it and making sure that everybody's safe, and he'll be there. But in the summer, he'll be with the fledglings, and that he takes them sort of further north in the park. And then in the fall and the winter, he also has a tendency to go more northerly. So it depends on what time of year it is, what you're looking. So this is a map of Central Park, and the nest is in the lower left, and then the P's are lots of perches. So he has lots of places on Fifth Avenue that he likes, and he has the Carlisle Hotel, which is off Madison. And then he has sort of hunting spots, which we know are kind of favorite places to get meals. And then there's sort of some favorite trees and favorite places where he'll eat, or he'll bring the kids to eat. So we kind of learn those, and if you have a hawk where you live or where you're watching hawks, same things happen. So if you'll learn where the nest is, you'll learn where the perches are, you'll learn where the hunting spots are, and you'll learn where eating spots are. So this is true for any red-tail. So today I went out to Central Park, and at this time of year, we would have expected eggs to have been laid a few weeks ago, and we would have expected Octavia to be sitting on the eggs. And so that did not happen this year. So although there's a possibility that she could be really, really late at doing it, it looks like this may be the first time in 25 years that this nest is not going to be used. So I had both pale male and I had Octavia on Fifth Avenue. Octavia was on the nest, pale male was on a building a few blocks north. But it looks like they may not lay eggs this year. So it may be an end of a continuous run that was fantastic. It may be that we are beginning to be at the end of an era with him. So I wanted to go through knowing that, and knowing that I think a joy of New York is being able to watch red tails. I wanted to go through a little bit about what's happened since pale male was the only nest in New York. We now have, 30 years later, we have this tremendous number. So these are what I know are pretty much active for this year. and that have, with the exception of the number 9, which is pale male's nest, I think all of them have had eggs laid, maybe with the exception of, there's a nest in Central Park we'll get to in a bit, but so we have this active set of nests. They vary. Some are in trees, some are in buildings, some are high up, some are not. And they're for a variety of places in New York, from the very tip of the north in Inwood Hill Park all the way down to Governor's Island. And so we just have this exciting selection of them. So I wanted to go through a few of them and just show you some of what's happened in New York since pale males arrived, and what's happening around Central Park. So the first one is an exciting one, and that's Terrence Cardinal Cook, which is formerly was a hospital that's now a rehabilitation center and nursing home. And it has, this year, a new nest. Hawks have tried to build on a ledge here for a while, but the wind blows away a nest before they can get enough material together. And this year, this pair was successful in building a good, solid nest such that it was big enough and well woven enough that it didn't blow off. And so they've been sitting on this nest since March 3rd, and so it's probably ready to hatch. And we never know exactly, because sometimes hawks sit on the nest before they lay their eggs for a few days, and so we don't really let you know when the exact day these eggs were laid. But this may be the first nest to hatch in the city. It has there's a hill at the compost heap that actually, when you're on that hill, you're level with the nest. And so you get a good look in. And there's also a view from a set of benches when you come up the 102nd Street path that, if they're kids, it'll be a great place to set up a scope and invite people to come watch. So we have, I have great expectations for this nest. I hope that in the next few days we have the news that they're the first hatched nest in the city. We have a nest at 310 West 72nd Street. It's in a gutter that goes the length of the building. And it's really, really difficult to see into. So I can stand at Broadway and the Trader Joe's with a scope and look in and see the mother, but can't see much else. And then later on, before the kids fled, so the last week of May, the kids end up hanging out and jumping, and you can see them, but it's difficult. So this is a nest where we don't get to see the little irises. We get to see the irises grown up and almost ready to go and leave. This is an interesting location because the parents have a tendency to stay on buildings and have the kids stay on buildings. So the kids end up on buildings on West End and on rooftop gardens and all kinds of places for much longer than one would expect. It's close to Riverside Park. We always thought that they would just take them right to Riverside Park, and they don't. They end up in Lincoln Towers, lawns, and other places. So this is a very urban set of hawks. And the parents have a tendency to do most of their hunting on Broadway, getting pigeons from Lincoln Center all the way up to maybe 76th Street. So fascinating, very, very urban group. And if you have a planter that somehow manages to not have any plants after a while, maybe it's that this young hawk came and made a visit. Sure, having fun. But again, this urban experience of having just kids on water tanks and not going to trees is very common for this nest. And this is a nest that this pair was very, very interesting for us, for me. So this nest started on 350 Central Park West, and that was 3 years ago. The first year it failed. The male got hit by a car, and the female couldn't continue to incubate the eggs on her own, so the nest failed. The next year, we have these wonderful little kids that came, and they're there, and things were great for 2 weeks. And then all of a sudden, there was nothing on the nest. And it turns out that the kids all died, and then the mother died a few weeks later. And the thoughts were that it was a disease of France that got the family, because they eat lots of pigeons there. This year, they moved the nest, and the nest ended up on 115 Fifth Avenue. And you could see from that construction crew, they were working on the facade. And so there's a little bit of a blue tarp there that's on the lower right-hand corner. And that whole section had been removed. And so the construction crew had to put back that section. So they were drilling and blasting away at it. So after a week of having these clearly hawks sitting on eggs, the hawks abandoned this nest. And then within a day, there was this hawk nest that instantly got built in their territory at the west 0302 light on the west drive of the park. And that means that the 03 means it's at 103rd Street, and 02 means it's a second light. And so we're excited because we hope that they can second clutch. If they do, the recycle time is probably about 25 days. And so we're hopeful for this pair. So, but then we have other hawks that don't get it together well. And one of the things that's really fascinating about Pamela is how well he did and how consistent he was. But we have a pair at San Remo, and people call them Fred and Ginger. And they have tried multiple buildings. They started at 322 Central Park West. They tried the Beresford one year. Last year they tried the Majestic. They tried a air conditioner across from the American Museum of Natural History. And they just don't seem to get it right. And you'll see here that they didn't build their nest in time, and partly because the nest is so high, it's hard to bring a lot of material up. But she's already laid an egg, and there's no nest. And this ledge has a 10-degree angle. So you saw that. So that's happened more than once. So it's a pair that we keep watching and keep seeing just that they don't get their act together. So it's in this beautiful arch, the San Remo, which is a twin-towered building. It's an iconic building in New York. But we never, ever get what we want. And I think it may show that, that where I see is that once you get to a building height over maybe 25 stories, it's really too much work to bring material up and to get enough up and get their nest woven before the winds blow off those twigs. So you can see here, there are already twigs falling off. Again, this is another year of her just having laid the eggs, laid an egg before the nest is ready. And I just, feel for her, but it just shows you how it's hard to get to territory together and get your nest together and do that. It's a tough thing to be in the city. This is another area in Central Park South. They may have been a pair that had been at Sheep Meadow, but they've been trying to nest on the Plaza, the Crown Building, and Sherry Netherland. We see them every year, but we never see any kids. And this year, I got sent pictures by an engineer who works at the St. Regis Hotel, and they tried to nest on an oval window, and then the lights were turning on at night, and so they abandoned it, not realizing what had happened. And then they laid an egg on a terrace. So another just difficult situation. And here, pigeon spikes are just a nuisance for hawks. They're hurting the predator that actually would get rid of your pigeon. So not so great. But again, we just have these incredible views on buildings like the Crown Building or the Sherry Netherland of these hawks, but nothing seems to come of their nests. St. John the Divine, which is close to the park, so it's at 113th Street and Morningside Drive. So it's you know, 3 blocks from the park, and has a long history of having hawk nests there and successful kids. And they've moved their nest to above St. Peter. And if you look at the back of the church, you can tell it's St. Peter because he has the keys to heaven in his hand. And this can be a fascinating place to watch. So on the horizon. And then nearby the park, we've always got lots of visitors. So got lots of juvenile hawks that spend the winter. And then we have what are single hawks that are called floaters, that they're always sort of trying to find another mate or a pair, and they're always going through the park. So we have lots of just random hawks sort of kind of around. So so that's our neighborhood. So to sum up what I think about Pale Male is I think he's fantastic. And I really love the ability to learn about him and to follow him and his history for a year or 2 years or 3 years or the time I've done, which is 15 years. It's very different from a different kind of bird watching than just checking the boxes as you go off and seeing what warblers you got. And if you're used to bird watching by doing sort of looking for things and checklisting, find a raptor that you can follow for a period of time. So I think it's a very, very rewarding experience. Certainly Pale Male has brought tremendous joy to me and the people I watch hawks with. So go out and watch them. So that's my talk. And I wanted to, thank you for giving money to Audubon, but I really wanted to make sure that everyone knew here that how much Pale Male has and red tails in New York City have been supported by Audubon. So I think a lot of us know about the nest cradle. The nest got taken down during renovations of the facade. The building was upset because they thought the nest would fall and they'd be liable. And so New York City Audubon, along with Parks, got an architect. They built a cradle. They had it built and fabricated. They installed it. And so I think we know that part. But to this day, a member of New York City Audubon coordinates with the building to make sure that any work that's going to be done on the facade, any building work, gets done in an appropriate time, not to disturb the nest. And so there's really great care and a great relationship between the building and Audubon and making sure that in the future, going forward, that Pale Male was protected. And so there was a lot of work that had been originally planned for May that ended up getting pushed to July and August so that it could be done safely. And so that's the credit to New York City Audubon. When Pale Male arrived in New York, it was legal to poison pigeons. And that poisoning ended up going up the food chain and was quite bad. So New York City Audubon helped in the effort to get those banned. And that's been in effect for a long time now in New York. Rodenticides have killed many of the hawks that we have in the city, including some of Pale Male's mates. And New York City Audubon has educational programs and brochures to help limit rodenticide use, and part of their efforts have also gone into making sure now there's a wildlife unit in the Parks Department, and they actually make sure that in every park where there's a nest that the rodenticides aren't used. So it's been a fantastic change from New York City Audubon. Lots of people call New York City Audubon about hawks that need rescuing, and New York City Audubon has done a fantastic job in making sure that there's a good network of people to coordinate with rehabbers and to make sure that that happens. And so I know of case after case where Audubon has been instrumental in making sure that those rescues happen. One of the things that's been important is figuring out why hawks die. And the money that you spent tonight goes to researchers at New York City Audubon who have in many, many cases taken dead hawks and had them had necropsies done and having them tested. And what we found what's been found over the last 20 years is that what looks like an accident really is a weakened hawk due to rodenticides. And so knowing that the death wasn't because of a car crash, but was because it was weakened has been really helpful in building the case against rodenticides. So fantastic work. You may know that recently New York City Audubon spearheaded the effort to get bird-safe glass supported in New York City. But New York City is doing so much more. New York City Audubon is doing so much more. They've done things, if you know the things like the LEED specification, which is getting your building certified as a green building. Originally, there was no points for having bird-safe glass or having a bird-safe design, and so they've helped change that. They've helped have a curriculum be written that gives architects training so that people who are going to architecture school learn about the dangers that their buildings can have for birds, so that they know not to build things a certain way. So if you have two sheets of glass that abut in a corner that are see-through, the birds can go right in through that thinking that they can get through. But if you make one wall darker and then one wall clear, then it's safe. So there are all these things you can do. And if you just talk to architects, I think the key thing was that architects who are older never had this curriculum in their education, so they don't know how to design an environmentally friendly building for birds. So fantastic kudos to Audubon for doing this work. And then lastly, Audubon has really, and I think with pale male especially, has helped make sure that New Yorkers know that New York City has wildlife, and that it's not just that wildlife is in national parks, and that the birds we have in New York City need to be protected. And so I'm incredibly grateful to the organization for what they do, and I'm incredibly thankful for all of you who paid to listen to me tonight, because I think it's fantastic work that's being done. So that said, hopefully Kevin can join us and give me some questions to field. And also, my blog is UrbanHawks.com, and I am very happy to if you go to that site, you'll see my email address, which is easy to do. It's bruce@yolton.com. And I'm very happy to have any questions that don't get answered tonight, to have you email me, and I'd be glad to field them for you. So.
Great, thank you so much, Bruce. All right, so we have a bunch of questions, which we'll likely not get through all of them tonight since we're already a little over. But let's see. I had a really good one here. Oh, geez. Now they're moving in, and I keep losing my place. When you say that an anonymous attendee wrote, when you say the end of an era in regard to pale male's nest, please explain. Do you mean the end of this year or forever?
So I don't know. And so it was really an end of an era question mark, right? So we've had 2 years of not having anything hatch with Octavia and pale male. And this year they're not nesting. So, I mean, and obviously there's a caveat there that they could maybe nest late, but it looks like they're not. And so there is this possibility that there is a possibility that maybe Octavia dies, there's a young girl that comes, and then we end up having babies again. But it may be that that they are both old, and that we're not going to have this sort of always having the summer having kids in that area of the park. So we'll see what happens. And I'm just saying that 25 years of consistency has been broken, and we'll have to look at what happens.
Great. Let's see. Takako has a question here. And they say, I see signs of keep off pesticide in Central Park. Doesn't this mean rodents eaten by pale male and others could be poisonous? How does Central Park handle this?
Okay, so there's pesticides and there's rodenticides. So most of what you're seeing about pesticides are chemicals that are used to get rid of weeds, or potentially in trees there might be invasive bugs in those trees. So by law, they're required to post their pesticide use. So that's different from rodenticides. And the park, Central Park, may use them very, very rarely, but does not use them commonly anymore. So there's a difference between pesticide and rodenticide.
Maria asked, how many children does pale male have, and how many grandchildren, and how would you know this?
There are people. I don't keep track of all of the kids, so there are people who keep track of all of them. And then I don't think we have any clue about the next generation. So the hawks that we have, other than pale male's nest, are probably, what's populated in New York is probably not related to pale male. Pale male's kids, the natal dispersal is pretty big. So they probably go, 50 to 200 or 300 miles away from their parents. So wherever that is, they aren't banded, so we don't know where they've gone. You could tally up the kids. I don't think the person who kept the best chart unfortunately passed away a few years ago, but I would say it's probably somewhere between 40 or 50, but I don't know exactly. And I never, keeping those stats never were important to me. But I would think that there should be grandchildren, and probably great-grandchildren, and probably great-great-grandchildren. But I don't know where they are, and I don't think anyone does.
Cool. All right, we'll take two more if that's okay.
So I see some Washington Square Park ones. So let me just answer that.
Sure.
Washington Square Park, as you know, 2 years ago, the male died, and a new male came and late in the nesting period, and then was very aggressive against the fledglings. And then last year, in the middle of COVID, they nested this new male and existing female, and then maybe a week or so after the eggs were laid, she passed away. Nobody found the body, and so it was just the nest had to be abandoned. So this year, there's a very attractive new female, and there's a male, and there's a male that died in Washington, near Washington Square Park, and so he looked very much like the male that had been there, but the male that's there now looks almost like the male that was there last year, so we can't tell. So I hope to have more photographs and know whether he's a replacement or not. She's been sitting on eggs, and the camera that used to be there will probably not get turned back on, because the system that it's on is actually being used for remote learning for NYU students. So I don't think anyone wants to pressure them to put the cameras back. And I will probably, now that this talk is over, I will probably go down there in the next few days and see how she's doing. But I think we're going to be, probably they should hatch in, late April. So.
Great. Let's see. We'll do one more question, and the rest can email Bruce from his website. So Jackie has a question. Do you know, will pale male and Octavia remain together if they aren't successful in having chicks?
Well, I don't know. So that's an interesting question, and I think what's one of the things that has happened with pale male is that we get to see things with pale male that most researchers don't get to see, right? So in a suburban or rural area, right, you would have a hard time keeping track of such longevity and knowing what happens when the hawks get older, right? So I don't think we know what will happen. And I think that's kind of the neat thing is we're going to get to watch, and we're going to get to see what happens when the hawk is if it's really still the same pale male. What happens to a hawk when he's 31 or 32, and what happens with the mate? Do they have a sort of retirement life, or does he look for another mate, or does she look for another mate? And what happens to that nest? And does somebody take it over and all that? And I don't think we know. So it's a question mark, and I think that's kind of the joy of this nest is we get to watch. So
great. All right. Oh, here you go. Here's Karen.
Those were excellent questions, and I know there are a lot more in the chat. So just a reminder to everybody, if you would like to know more and you'd like to follow Bruce's exploits with hawks and raptors in our city, go to UrbanHawks.com. You can learn just so much from his videos and photographs. If you can't find a hawk in the park, another tip that Bruce didn't share with you is just find Bruce, because he's there all the time. So just look for Bruce Yolton. Bruce, thank you so much for sharing the cuteness and the magnificence and the resilience of Pale Male and his progeny and raptors in our city. And thank you for the shout out to New York City Audubon for our work with raptors. This was a really wonderful evening, and I know everybody learned so much. Dr. Kevin Bergio, thank you for joining us tonight and handling the questions.
No
Really thrilled to have you here together. And to all of you, thank you for taking the time out tonight to be with us, to support New York City Audubon, to learn. Please join us for walks, for talks, for conservation actions. We're as strong as our membership. We'd love you to be with us. And good night to everybody, and thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Bruce. Good night, everyone.